The scent of freshly ground coffee beans hit Ryder Ashford like a physical force as he dismounted his horse outside the small cafe in Dalhart, Texas. And for the first time in 3 weeks on the trail, he felt something other than exhaustion. It was early spring in 1882, and the morning sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the dusty Main Street in shades of gold and amber. He had ridden through the night to reach civilization, his stomach growling and his body aching for something other than hardtack and jerky. But that smell, rich and intoxicating, cut through every other sensation and made him pause with his hand on the hitching post. Inside the cafe, Adelaide Morgan turned the handle of the coffee grinder with steady, practiced movements. Her father had opened this establishment 5 years ago, and she had been grinding beans every morning since she was old enough to manage the heavy cast iron mechanism. At 22 years old, she knew the rhythm by heart, knew exactly how fine to grind the beans for the perfect brew. The morning light filtered through the gingham curtains she had sewn herself, casting patterns on the worn wooden floor. She had already set out the tin cups and plates, swept the floor, and started heating water on the cast iron stove. Her father would be down from their rooms above the cafe soon, and by then she needed to have everything ready for the early customers. The bell above the door chimed, and Adelaide looked up to see a man she had never seen before stepping inside. He was tall, with sandy brown hair that needed a trim and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were covered in trail dust, and his boots left faint prints on her clean floor, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a startling blue, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her fingers falter on the coffee grinder. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "That coffee ready yet?" "Give me 5 minutes to brew it," Adelaide replied, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. "Take a seat anywhere you like." Ryder removed his hat and moved to a table near the window, but he could not take his eyes off the woman at the counter. She had auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress was plain calico, but there was something about the way she moved, efficient and graceful at once, that held his attention. He watched as she poured the grounds into a large metal pot and added boiling water, her movements sure and practiced. The smell intensified, and he found himself leaning back in his chair, breathing deeply. "You come far?" Adelaide asked, glancing over her shoulder at him as the coffee steeped. "Up from the Panhandle," Ryder said. "Been on the trail for 3 weeks moving cattle. We got them settled in pens outside town last night, and I drew the short straw for first watch. Just got relieved." "You must be hungry then," Adelaide said, turning to face him fully. "I have biscuits in the oven, and I can fry up some eggs and bacon if you like." "That sounds like heaven," Ryder admitted. "But honestly, it was that coffee smell that got me off my horse. I could smell it from halfway down the street." Adelaide felt a small smile tug at her lips despite her usual reserve with strangers. "My father always says I grind the beans just right. Not too fine, not too coarse." "Your father owns this place?" Ryder asked. "He does. Thomas Morgan. He will be down soon." Adelaide moved to the stove and began cracking eggs into a skillet. "You planning to stay in Dalhart long?" "Depends," Ryder said, watching her work. "The outfit I am with is selling the herd to a buyer here. Could be a few days, could be a week." The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Thomas Morgan's arrival. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. He took in the stranger at the table with a practiced glance and nodded in greeting. "Morning, stranger. I see my daughter is taking care of you. Better than I've been taken care of in weeks," Ryder said honestly. "I am Ryder Ashford with the Diamond Bar outfit out of the Panhandle." "Thomas Morgan," the older man said, extending his hand. Ryder stood and shook it firmly. "The Diamond Bar, you say? I heard you boys were bringing in a herd." "Yes, sir. About 800 head." Thomas whistled low. "That is a good-sized herd. You the trail boss?" "No, sir, just a hand. But I have been with the outfit for 5 years now." Adelaide brought Ryder his coffee, and when she set the cup down in front of him, their fingers brushed briefly. She pulled back quickly, a flush creeping up her neck, and hurried back to the stove to check on his breakfast. Ryder wrapped his hands around the hot cup and took a tentative sip. The coffee was perfect, strong and smooth without the bitterness that came from over-brewing or burning. He closed his eyes and let the heat and flavor wash over him. "This is the best coffee I have ever had," he said, and he meant it. Adelaide turned, surprise evident on her face. "You are just saying that because you have been on the trail." "No, madam," Ryder said, meeting her eyes. "I have had coffee in every town from here to Kansas, and this is something special." Thomas chuckled. "My Adelaide has a gift, no doubt about it. Half the men in this town come here just for her coffee." "I can see why," Ryder said, taking another sip. He watched as Adelaide plated his breakfast, adding biscuits from the oven that were golden brown and steaming. When she brought it to his table, the smell made his mouth water. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," he said. "You are welcome, Mr. Ashford." As Ryder ate, more customers began to trickle in. Adelaide moved between tables with practiced ease, taking orders and delivering food while Thomas worked the kitchen. Ryder found himself watching her whenever he could, noticing the way she remembered each customer's preferences without being told, the way she had a kind word for everyone who came through the door. There was a warmth to her that seemed at odds with the hardscrabble town of Dalhart, a gentleness that he had not encountered in a long time. When he finished eating, Ryder paid for his meal and stood to leave. Adelaide was grinding more coffee beans, the sound rhythmic and soothing in the busy cafe. He found himself drawn to the counter, hat in hand. "Miss Morgan," he said, and she looked up at him with those warm brown eyes. "I just wanted to say that coffee, this meal, it is the finest start to a morning I have had in longer than I can remember." "I am glad you enjoyed it," Adelaide said, a genuine smile crossing her face. Ryder knew he should leave, should get back to the camp and catch some sleep before his next shift, but instead he found himself saying, "Would it be too forward of me to ask if you might make coffee like that every morning?" Adelaide's hand stilled on the grinder. "I do make coffee every morning. That is part of running a cafe." "I meant," Ryder paused, searching for the right words. The lack of sleep was making him bold, or maybe it was just something about this woman that made him want to take chances. "I meant, would you consider waking up beside me every morning and making coffee like that?" The cafe went quiet. Adelaide stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. Thomas had stopped mid-motion in the kitchen, a spatula suspended in air. Even the other customers seemed frozen, watching this stranger proposition, the beloved Adelaide Morgan. Adelaide's face flushed deep red. "Mr. Ashford, I think you need to leave now." Ryder's own face colored as he realized what he had just said, how it must have sounded. "Miss Morgan, I apologize. That came out wrong. I did not mean to offend you. I just meant, well, I suppose I do not know what I meant. I am sorry." He jammed his hat on his head and practically fled the cafe, the sound of the bell above the door seeming to mock him as he stepped into the bright morning sunlight. He could feel the eyes of every person in that cafe boring into his back. What had possessed him to say such a thing? He had been around cowboys too long, forgotten how to talk to respectable women. He had basically just proposed marriage to a woman he had known for all of 30 minutes. Behind the counter, Adelaide's hands were shaking as she tried to resume grinding the coffee beans. Her father came to stand beside her, his expression unreadable. "That was unexpected," Thomas said quietly. "He must be addled from lack of sleep," Adelaide said, her voice not quite steady. "Trail fatigue or something." "Maybe," Thomas said, but there was a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Or maybe he just recognized something good when he saw it." Adelaide did not respond. She focused on the coffee beans, on the familiar motion of the grinder, trying to calm her racing heart. No man had ever said anything like that to her before. Most of the men in Dalhart treated her like a sister or a daughter, too afraid of her father to show any romantic interest. And the few who had shown interest had been tentative, awkward, nothing like the bold directness of Ryder Ashford. She told herself she was offended. She told herself it was inappropriate and presumptuous. But underneath those proper reactions, there was something else, a flutter of excitement that she could not quite suppress. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something raw and honest that had made her breath catch. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of customers and chores. Adelaide tried to push the encounter from her mind, but she kept remembering the way Ryder had closed his eyes when he first tasted the coffee, the genuine appreciation in his voice. She had never seen someone react to her coffee like that, as if it was something precious and rare. By mid-afternoon, Adelaide was helping her father prepare for the dinner crowd when the bell above the door chimed again. She looked up and felt her stomach flip. Ryder Ashford had returned, cleaned up this time, his hair damp from a recent wash and his face freshly shaved. He held his hat in his hands and looked almost nervous. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Morgan," he said, nodding to them both. "May I have a word?" Thomas looked at his daughter, then back at Ryder. "I suppose you may." Ryder approached the counter, and Adelaide noticed that several customers had gone quiet again, clearly interested in this development. "Miss Morgan, I came to apologize properly," Ryder said. "What I said this morning was completely out of line. I had been awake for near about 36 hours and was not thinking clearly. I spoke without consideration for your feelings or your reputation, and that was wrong of me." Adelaide found herself studying his face, noting the sincerity in his expression. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Ashford. I would like to make it up to you if I could," Ryder continued. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner? Somewhere other than your own cafe, I mean. The hotel restaurant, perhaps, or wherever you might like to go." Adelaide felt her father's eyes on her, but when she glanced at him, he simply raised an eyebrow, leaving the decision to her. "I do not know you, Mr. Ashford," Adelaide said carefully. "You rode into town this morning, and within minutes of meeting me, you said something wildly inappropriate. Why should I trust you enough to have dinner with you?" "You should not," Ryder admitted. "Not based on that. But I am asking anyway, because I cannot stop thinking about that coffee and about the woman who made it. I am not usually a reckless man, Miss Morgan, but something about you makes me want to take risks." Despite herself, Adelaide felt a smile tugging at her lips. "That is quite a line, Mr. Ashford." "It is not a line," Ryder said quietly. "It is the truth. I have been working cattle since I was 15 years old. I have been from Texas to Montana and back again. I have never stayed in one place long, never had much reason to. But that coffee this morning, the way you moved around this cafe, the kindness in your eyes, it made me think maybe I have been missing something important." The cafe was completely silent now, every person hanging on their words. Adelaide felt heat creeping up her neck again, but this time it was not entirely from embarrassment. "One dinner," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow evening, after the cafe closes, you may take me to the hotel restaurant." Ryder's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his features. Thank you, Miss Morgan. I promise you will not regret it. After he left, Adelaide had to endure the knowing looks and whispered comments of every customer in the cafe. Her father said nothing, but she caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression more than once throughout the afternoon. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the rooms above the cafe, Adelaide stared at the ceiling and wondered what she had agreed to. She barely knew Ryder Ashford. He was a drifter, a cowboy, exactly the kind of man her father had always warned her about. Men like that never stayed, never put down roots. They chased horizons and left broken hearts in their wake, but she could not forget the way he had looked at her, or the way her heart had jumped when he walked back into the cafe that afternoon. There was something about him that called to her, something she could not quite name or explain. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Adelaide went through her usual routine, grinding coffee, taking orders, serving customers, but her mind was elsewhere. She changed clothes 3 times that evening before settling on her best dress, a deep blue calico with ivory buttons that her father had bought her for her last birthday. She pinned her hair up carefully, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face, and pinched her cheeks for color. When Ryder arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, he was wearing what were clearly his best clothes, though they were still worn from years of use. His hair was neatly combed, and he smelled faintly of soap and leather. When he saw Adelaide, his eyes widened. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Adelaide replied, feeling suddenly shy. "Let me just tell my father I am leaving." Thomas came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked Ryder up and down with an assessing gaze. "Have her back by 9 o'clock, Thomas said. "And Mr. Ashford, my daughter is precious to me. Treat her with respect." "I will, sir," Ryder promised. "You have my word." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Dalhart, which admittedly was not saying much. The town was still rough around the edges, built more for function than comfort. But the restaurant had real tablecloths and actual menus, and the food was prepared by a cook who had once worked in a fine establishment in San Antonio. Ryder held Adelaide's chair for her and she sat, feeling suddenly nervous. Now that they were here alone together, she was not sure what to say, but Ryder seemed determined to make conversation. "Tell me about yourself," he said after they had ordered. "Have you lived in Dalhart your whole life?" "No," Adelaide said. "We moved here from Missouri when I was 17. My mother had passed away the year before, and my father wanted a fresh start. He had always dreamed of running his own cafe, so we came west. That must have been difficult, leaving everything you knew." "It was," Adelaide admitted, "but Dalhart has been good to us. The people here are kind, and the cafe does well enough to keep us comfortable." "You never thought about doing something else, going somewhere else?" Adelaide considered the question. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see more of the world. But my father needs me, and honestly, I like the work. I like providing something people need, making them comfortable, hearing their stories." "You are good at it," Ryder said. "I could tell that just from watching you work. You remember what everyone likes. You know how to make them feel welcome." "What about you?" Adelaide asked, wanting to turn the conversation away from herself. "You said you have been working cattle since you were 15. Where are you from originally?" "Oklahoma," Ryder said. "My parents had a small farm, but they both died of fever when I was 14. I had a choice between going to an orphanage or making my own way, so I learned to ride and rope and convinced the Diamond Bar to take me on. I have been with them ever since." Adelaide's heart ached at the matter-of-fact way he described such tragedy. That must have been terribly hard. "It was what it was," Ryder said with a shrug. "I survived, learned a trade, made something of myself. I have saved up a fair amount over the years, been careful with my money." Their food arrived and they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Adelaide found herself relaxing, enjoying Ryder's company. He was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to her answers. There was none of the false bravado she often saw in cowboys, no tall tales or exaggerations. He seemed content to let the conversation flow naturally. "Can I ask you something?" Adelaide said as they finished their meal. "What made you say what you said yesterday morning?" "About waking up beside you." Ryder set down his fork and met her eyes. "Honestly, I do not fully know. It was like something came over me when I smelled that coffee. I had been on the trail so long, sleeping on hard ground, eating poor food, dealing with difficult cattle and difficult men. And then I walked into your cafe and suddenly there was this moment of perfect peace. The smell of the coffee, the warmth of the place, the sight of you working there so capably. It felt like home, like something I did not even know I was looking for." And before I could think better of it, the words just came out. "That was quite possibly the strangest proposal I will ever receive," Adelaide said, but she was smiling. "Was it a proposal?" Ryder asked. "I suppose it was in a roundabout way. Not my finest moment, I will admit." "And yet you came back and asked me to dinner." "Because I could not stop thinking about you," Ryder said simply. "I went back to camp, tried to sleep, but all I could see was your face. All I could smell was that coffee. I decided I would rather take the risk of being rejected than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had tried." Adelaide felt her breath catch. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, with such direct honesty. "You do not even know me." "Then let me get to know you," Ryder said, reaching across the table to gently touch her hand. "I know I am a drifter. I know I probably have no business courting a respectable woman like you, but I am asking anyway. Stay here while we sell the herd. Let me take you to dinner again. Let me prove that what I feel is real." Adelaide looked at their hands, his rough and calloused from years of hard work, hers stained with coffee grounds despite her best efforts to scrub them clean. She should say no. She should protect her heart. But instead she heard herself say, "All right. You can court me, Ryder Ashford, but properly, with my father's permission and with respect for my reputation." "I would not have it any other way," Ryder promised. Over the next week, Ryder became a fixture at the cafe. He came every morning for coffee, and Adelaide found herself grinding the beans with extra care, wanting each cup to be perfect. They talked across the counter when she was not too busy, sharing stories and learning about each other. Ryder told her about life on the trail, about the vast open spaces and the challenges of moving hundreds of animals across difficult terrain. Adelaide told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother and the dreams she had once had. In the evenings, after the cafe closed, Ryder would take Adelaide for walks around Dalhart. It was not a large town, but they found ways to make the strolls interesting, talking about everything and nothing. Ryder was attentive and respectful, never pushing for more than Adelaide was willing to give, and she found herself falling for him despite her best efforts to guard her heart. Thomas watched the courtship with careful eyes. He had been protective of Adelaide since her mother died, perhaps overly so, but he could not find fault with Ryder's behavior. The young man was polite, punctual, and clearly smitten with his daughter. But Thomas also knew the reality of cowboys' lives, the way they drifted from place to place, never settling down. On the 8th day after Ryder first walked into the cafe, Thomas asked him to stay after closing. Adelaide was upstairs, and the two men sat at one of the tables with cups of coffee between them. "I assume you know what I want to talk about," Thomas said. "I believe I do, sir," Ryder replied. "You want to know my intentions toward your daughter." "That is part of it," Thomas acknowledged. But mostly I want to know what happens when your outfit moves on. Because they will move on, Ryder. Cowboys always do. Ryder had known this conversation was coming, had been thinking about little else for days. You are right, sir. The Diamond Bar will be leaving in a few days, heading back to the Panhandle, and normally I would be going with them. Normally, Thomas repeated. Sir, I love your daughter, Ryder said, and hearing himself say it out loud made it feel even more real. I know that sounds crazy. We have only known each other a week. But I have never felt this way about anyone before, and I do not want to let it go. I have been saving my wages for years, living cheap on the trail. I have enough money to start something of my own, a small ranch maybe, or a business here in town. I want to stay in Dalhart. I want to build a life with Adelaide if she will have me. Thomas studied Ryder's face for a long moment. What if she says no? What if you give up your job and she decides she does not feel the same way? Then I will still have to live with that decision, Ryder said. But I would rather take the risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what if. You are either very brave or very foolish, Thomas said, but there was a hint of respect in his voice. Maybe both. Adelaide is upstairs. Why do not you go ask her what she thinks about all this? Ryder climbed the stairs with his heart pounding. He knocked gently on the door at the top, and Adelaide opened it, surprise evident on her face. Ryder, what are you doing up here? Your father said I could come talk to you, Ryder said. Can we sit somewhere? Adelaide led him to the small sitting room, and they sat on the worn sofa that had been her mother's favorite piece of furniture. Ryder took her hands in his, gathering his courage. Adelaide, I need to tell you something. The Diamond Bar is leaving in 3 days, heading back to the Panhandle. Adelaide felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, had known from the beginning that Ryder was only passing through, but it still hurt to hear him say it out loud. I see. I am not going with them, Ryder continued, and Adelaide's eyes snapped up to meet his. I am staying here in Dalhart. I have money saved, enough to start something of my own. I do not know what yet, maybe a small ranch, maybe something else entirely. But I am staying because I cannot imagine leaving you. Ryder, you cannot give up your life for me, Adelaide protested. We barely know each other. I know enough, Ryder said firmly. I know that I think about you constantly. I know that waking up every morning and coming to your cafe is the best part of my day. I know that the thought of riding away from here and never seeing you again makes me physically ill. I love you, Adelaide Morgan. I know it is fast, I know it is crazy, but it is true. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I tried not to. I tried to tell myself it was too soon, that I was being foolish. But I love you, Ryder Ashford. Ryder pulled her into his arms, and Adelaide let herself sink into his embrace. He smelled like leather and coffee and something uniquely him. She felt safe there, protected, like she had finally found something she had been missing without even knowing it. Marry me, Ryder said into her hair. I know I proposed in the worst possible way the first time, but I am asking properly now. Marry me, Adelaide. Wake up beside me every morning. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you have everything you need. Yes, Adelaide said, pulling back to look at him with shining eyes. Yes, I will marry you. Ryder kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Adelaide felt like her heart might burst from happiness. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. We should tell your father, Ryder said. He is probably listening at the door, Adelaide replied with a laugh. They went downstairs hand in hand to find Thomas sitting at the same table, his coffee cup empty. He looked up as they approached, and one look at their faces told him everything he needed to know. I assume congratulations are in order, Thomas said. She said yes, Ryder confirmed, unable to keep the joy out of his voice. Thomas stood and embraced his daughter, then extended his hand to Ryder. Welcome to the family, son, but if you ever hurt her, I will tan your hide." "Understood, sir," Ryder said seriously. "I will spend every day trying to make her happy." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ryder went to the Diamond Bar camp and tendered his resignation. The trail boss was sorry to see him go but understood when Ryder explained the situation. Several of the other hands ribbed him good-naturedly about being caught by a pretty face and good coffee, but they all wished him well. Adelaide and her father started planning a wedding. It would be small, given that Adelaide had no family besides Thomas in Dalhart, but the whole town was invited to celebrate. The cafe became a hub of activity as neighbors stopped by to offer congratulations and help with preparations. Meanwhile, Ryder started looking into opportunities in Dalhart. He talked to the banker, to other business owners, trying to figure out what the town needed. He had enough money for a small piece of land outside town, enough to start raising horses maybe, or cattle on a smaller scale. But he wanted to be smart about it, to build something sustainable. It was Adelaide who came up with the solution. "What if you partnered with my father?" she suggested one evening as they sat on the porch of the cafe watching the sunset. "The cafe does well, but he has always talked about expanding, maybe adding rooms for travelers. You have business sense and capital. Together you could build something really special." The more Ryder thought about it, the more he liked the idea. He approached Thomas the next day, and after a long discussion, they shook hands on a partnership. They would expand the cafe, adding a small boarding house on the adjacent lot that Thomas had been renting for storage. Ryder would manage the boarding house side while continuing to help with the cafe. It was perfect, allowing Ryder to be involved in the business without stepping on Thomas's toes. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after Ryder first walked into the cafe. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, officiated by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Adelaide wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and only slightly yellowed with age. Thomas walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and Ryder thought he had never seen anything more beautiful than Adelaide in that moment, the sunlight streaming through the windows making her auburn hair glow like fire. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ryder kissed his bride as the small congregation erupted in applause. Adelaide smiled against his lips, and Ryder felt a sense of rightness settle over him, like every step of his life had been leading to this moment. The reception was held in the cafe, tables pushed together to create one long surface laden with food that the townspeople had contributed. There was dancing and music, laughter and toasts. Ryder danced with his new wife, holding her close and marveling at how his life had changed in such a short time. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Thomas pulled the newlyweds aside. "I had the rooms above the cafe prepared for you," he said, "but I am going to stay with the Hendersons tonight to give you privacy. The place is yours." After Thomas left, Ryder and Adelaide climbed the stairs to what was now their home. Adelaide had prepared the rooms earlier, putting fresh linens on the bed and opening the windows to let in the evening breeze. They stood together in the small bedroom, suddenly shy with each other despite the vows they had just exchanged. "I cannot believe this is real," Adelaide said softly. 3 weeks ago I had never met you. Now you are my husband." "I fell in love with you the moment I smelled that coffee," Ryder said, pulling her close. "I know people think we are crazy getting married so fast. Maybe we are, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life." They made love that night with the windows open, the sounds of Dalhart settling down for the evening floating up to them. It was tender and a little awkward, both of them learning each other, but it was also beautiful and right. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, talking quietly until they drifted off to sleep. Ryder woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of early mornings on the trail. For a moment he was disoriented, not recognizing his surroundings. Then he felt Adelaide warm beside him, and everything came rushing back. He was married. He had a wife. He had a home. He slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake her, and padded downstairs in his bare feet. The cafe was quiet and dark, but Ryder knew where everything was now. He found the coffee beans and the grinder and began to work, trying to match the rhythm he had watched Adelaide use so many times. Upstairs, Adelaide stirred and reached for Ryder, finding only empty space. She sat up, momentarily confused, then heard the sound of the coffee grinder from below. She wrapped herself in a robe and crept down the stairs. The sight that greeted her made her heart swell. Ryder stood at the counter in his nightshirt, his hair sticking up in every direction, grinding coffee beans with intense concentration. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten, painting the world in shades of gray and pink. "What are you doing?" Adelaide asked softly. Ryder turned, a sheepish smile on his face. "I wanted to surprise you. I wanted to make you coffee for once, instead of always being on the receiving end. But I am not sure I have the grind quite right." Adelaide crossed to him and looked at the grounds. "It is a little fine, but it will work." She covered his hand with hers on the grinder. "Here, let me show you." Together they ground more beans, Adelaide guiding Ryder's movements. Then she showed him how to measure the grounds, how long to let the water boil before adding them, how long to let it steep. Ryder watched her face as she worked, memorizing every detail, wanting to learn this ritual that was so important to her. When the coffee was ready, they poured 2 cups and sat at one of the cafe tables as the sun rose, bathing the room in golden light. Ryder took a sip and grimaced slightly. "Not quite as good as yours," he admitted. "It takes practice," Adelaide said, but she was smiling. "But I appreciate the effort." "I meant what I said that first morning," Ryder said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want this, Adelaide. This life, this cafe, this town, all of it with you." "You have it," Adelaide promised. "You have me, for all of my days." They sat together as Dalhart woke up around them, drinking their coffee and planning their future. Thomas returned mid-morning, and they reopened the cafe together. The customers who came in that day all congratulated the newlyweds, and more than one person commented on how happy Adelaide looked. Life fell into a rhythm over the following weeks and months. Ryder threw himself into the expansion of the cafe and the construction of the boarding house. He proved to have a good head for business, handling the financial side of things and negotiating with suppliers. Thomas taught him the ins and outs of running a cafe, and Ryder learned to cook passable meals and make decent coffee, though never quite as good as Adelaide's. Adelaide continued to grind coffee every morning, and true to his word, Ryder woke beside her every day. Sometimes he would join her downstairs, helping with the morning preparations. Other times he would simply watch from the doorway, marveling at his good fortune. The boarding house was completed by late summer, a simple but sturdy structure with 6 rooms for rent. It quickly became popular with travelers passing through Dalhart, and between the cafe and the boarding house, the family business thrived. Ryder hired a young widow named Martha to help run the boarding house, giving her a steady income and a place to live in one of the rooms. As autumn arrived, painting the Texas landscape in golds and russets, Adelaide discovered she was with child. She told Ryder one morning as they ground coffee together, and he lifted her off her feet in joy, spinning her around the empty cafe. Thomas was equally delighted, already planning how to spoil his grandchild. The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and Ryder took over most of her duties in the cafe, learning through trial and error how to manage everything. He was endlessly patient with her, holding her hair when she was ill, bringing her crackers and weak tea, rubbing her feet when they swelled. "I am sorry," Adelaide said one evening when she had been particularly ill. "I know this is not what you signed up for." "This is exactly what I signed up for," Ryder corrected gently. "For better or worse, in sickness and in health. Remember." As Adelaide's pregnancy progressed, she regained her energy and returned to work, though Ryder and Thomas both insisted she take it easy. She continued to grind the coffee beans every morning, though Ryder stood close by, ready to take over if she tired. The regular customers all noticed her growing belly and offered advice, gifts, and predictions about whether the baby would be a boy or girl. Winter came, and with it a fierce cold snap that had everyone in Dalhart huddling close to their stoves. Adelaide grew large and uncomfortable, and Ryder worried constantly. He had seen too many women die in childbirth on the frontier, had heard too many stories of things going wrong. But he kept his fears to himself, not wanting to frighten his wife. The baby came on a snowy February morning in 1883. Adelaide's water broke as she was grinding the morning coffee, and Ryder sent the Mexican boy who worked in the boarding house running for the doctor. Thomas took charge of the cafe while Ryder helped Adelaide upstairs, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The labor was long and difficult. Adelaide labored through the day and into the night, and Ryder stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her brow. The doctor, a gruff man named Harrison who had delivered half the babies in Dalhart, assured them that everything was progressing normally. But Ryder could see the worry in his eyes as the hours stretched on. Finally, just after midnight, their son was born. He came into the world screaming lustily, his face red and wrinkled. The doctor cleaned him up and placed him in Adelaide's arms, and both parents stared at him in wonder. "He is perfect," Adelaide breathed, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "He is ours," Ryder said, his own eyes wet. He touched his son's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers curled around his thumb with surprising strength. They named him Robert Thomas Ashford, after Ryder's father and Adelaide's. The whole town celebrated his arrival, and for weeks the cafe was full of visitors bringing gifts and wanting to see the baby. Ryder found himself fascinated by this tiny person, watching him sleep and eat and slowly begin to focus his eyes on the world around him. Fatherhood changed Ryder in ways he had not expected. He had always been responsible and hardworking, but now he had someone depending on him entirely. He threw himself into the business with renewed vigor, determined to build something substantial for his son to inherit someday. The cafe and boarding house continued to thrive, and Ryder began buying property around Dalhart, investing their profits wisely. Adelaide returned to work when Robert was 6 weeks old, though at a reduced capacity. She would bring the baby downstairs with her, keeping him in a cradle near the counter while she worked. The customers loved it, and more than one tough cowboy could be seen making silly faces at the baby while waiting for their coffee. Life was not without challenges. There were lean months when business slowed, illnesses that swept through the town, difficult customers, and unexpected expenses. But Ryder and Adelaide faced everything together, their love deepening with each shared experience. When Robert was 2 years old, Adelaide became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1885 they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Adelaide's mother. Where Robert was sturdy and serious, Little Margaret was delicate and joyful, smiling at everyone who looked at her. Adelaide and Ryder marveled at how different their children were, how each had their own distinct personality from the very beginning. Thomas aged gracefully, still working in the cafe but gradually handing more responsibility over to his daughter and son-in-law. He spent hours with his grandchildren, telling them stories and teaching them to count using coffee beans. Ryder watched the old man with his children and felt grateful that they had this grandfather figure in their lives. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Dalhart grew from a rough frontier town into a more established community. More businesses opened, more families settled. The railroad came through, bringing new opportunities and new customers to the cafe. Ryder expanded again, buying the building next door and opening a general store with Thomas as a silent partner. Robert grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and numbers, showing an early aptitude for business. Margaret was more outgoing, charming everyone she met with her easy smile and kind heart. They both learned to grind coffee as soon as they were tall enough to reach the counter, carrying on Adelaide's tradition. When Robert was 10 and Margaret was 8, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. It was unexpected, and she was older now, 34 to Ryder's 33. But the baby came easily, a surprise son they named William, who seemed to be a perfect blend of his older siblings. Through it all, Ryder never forgot his promise. Every morning he woke beside Adelaide. Every morning they ground coffee together, though Ryder had long since learned to do it properly on his own. It was their ritual, their moment of connection before the busy day began. Sometimes Thomas would join them, other times one or more of the children. But it was always special, always meaningful. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder closed the cafe and boarding house for the day, something he had never done before. He took Adelaide and the children on a picnic to a spot outside town where wildflowers grew thick, and the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions. Thomas came too, having aged into his 70s, but still spry enough to play with his grandchildren. As they sat on blankets eating fried chicken and biscuits, Robert asked, "Papa, why did you decide to stay in Dalhart? The other cowboys always move around." Ryder looked at Adelaide, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with still shining through despite the years and the responsibilities. Her auburn hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes, but she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "I stayed because of your mother," Ryder said simply. "I smelled the coffee she was grinding one morning, and I knew I had found something worth staying for. Worth building a life for." "That is a silly reason to stay in one place," Margaret said with the confidence of an 8-year-old. "Maybe," Ryder acknowledged, "but sometimes the most important decisions we make seem silly at first. I asked your mother to wake up beside me every morning, and she said yes. Everything good in my life comes from that decision." Adelaide reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I would make the same choice again in a heartbeat." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the Ashford family packed up their picnic and headed back to town. Ryder drove the wagon with Adelaide beside him and the children in the back, listening to Thomas tell them stories about the old days. He thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, tired and rootless, searching for something he could not name. That morning in the cafe had changed everything, had set him on a path to a life richer and more fulfilling than he ever could have imagined. More years passed. Robert left for college in Austin, determined to study business and law. Margaret met a young rancher and fell head over heels in love, getting married in the same church where her parents had wed. William grew into a teenager who showed an interest in cooking, spending hours in the cafe kitchen learning from his grandfather and mother. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, with Adelaide and Ryder by his side. The whole town turned out for his funeral, testament to how loved he had been. He left the cafe to Adelaide and the general store to Ryder, having built a legacy that would continue through his family. The death hit Adelaide hard. She had never known a time without her father, had worked beside him for over 30 years. Ryder held her through her grief, understanding the depth of her loss. He took over more of the day-to-day operations, giving her time to mourn and heal. Slowly, Adelaide found her way back. She returned to grinding coffee every morning, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. And one morning, about 6 months after Thomas's death, she found herself smiling as she worked, remembering something her father had said years ago about Ryder either being very brave or very foolish. He had been both, she decided, and she loved him all the more for it. Robert returned from college with a law degree and opened a practice in Dalhart, determined to serve the community where he had grown up. Margaret had 2 children of her own and brought them to the cafe regularly, teaching them to grind coffee just as she had been taught. William took over the kitchen, developing a reputation as one of the finest cooks in the Texas Panhandle. On their 25th anniversary, Ryder surprised Adelaide by taking her back to the spot where they had picnicked years before. It was just the 2 of them this time, their children grown and busy with their own lives. They sat on a blanket as the sun set, drinking coffee from a thermos Adelaide had prepared that morning. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked. "Giving up the cowboy life, staying in one place all these years?" "Not for a single second," Ryder said without hesitation. "You gave me something I did not even know I needed. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving from day to day." "I used to wonder what it would be like to see the world," Adelaide mused. "Before you came along, I thought maybe I was missing out on something, staying in Dalhart and running the cafe. And now I know that the best things in life are not about how far you travel, but about who you travel with," Adelaide said. She leaned against Ryder's shoulder, comfortable and content. "You gave me adventure without ever having to leave home. Every day with you has been an adventure." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. After a while, Ryder spoke again. "Do you remember what I said to you that first morning?" "How could I forget?" Adelaide laughed. "You basically proposed to me before I even knew your name." "I said I wanted you to wake up beside me every morning," Ryder said. "And you have. Every single morning for 25 years. That is 9,131 mornings, give or take. 9,131 times I have gotten to watch you grind coffee, watch you move through your day with grace and kindness. 9,131 chances to thank God that I walked into that cafe." Adelaide felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You counted." "Of course I counted," Ryder said softly. "Every morning is a gift. I never want to take that for granted." They held each other as the night deepened around them, the vast Texas sky spread above them like a blanket. In the distance, they could see the lights of Dalhart, their home, their legacy. The cafe would open tomorrow morning, and Adelaide would grind the coffee while Ryder worked beside her, just as they had for 25 years. Their children would come by with grandchildren in tow. Customers would filter in, expecting the best coffee in town and receiving it. It was a simple life in many ways, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of love and sustained by daily commitment. Ryder thought about the young cowboy he had been, riding into town exhausted and searching for nothing more than a hot meal. He could never have imagined the richness that waited for him in that small cafe. in the form of a woman grinding coffee beans. As they drove back to town that night, Ryder's hand found Adelaide's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new ordinary miracles. But tonight was perfect, complete in itself, a celebration of all they had built together. The years continued their steady march. Ryder's hair turned fully gray, and Adelaide's auburn locks faded to silver. Their bodies moved more slowly, ached more readily, but their love remained constant. They hired more help for the cafe and the boarding house, stepping back from the day-to-day operations but remaining involved. Robert's law practice flourished, and he became a respected voice in Dalhart's growing government. Margaret's ranching operation expanded, becoming one of the most successful in the region. William eventually took over the cafe entirely, bringing his own innovations while respecting the traditions his mother and grandfather had established. Each of the children married and had children of their own, filling the Ashford family tree with new branches. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cafe for a celebration. There were children and grandchildren everywhere, ranging from tiny babies to sullen teenagers. The cafe was packed with well-wishers from throughout Dalhart and beyond, testament to the place the Ashford family had carved out in the community. William had prepared a feast, and after everyone had eaten their fill, Robert stood to make a speech. He was in his 40s now, a distinguished man with his father's steady gaze and his mother's warm smile. 40 years ago, Robert began, my father walked into this cafe for the first time. He was a drifting cowboy with no ties and no real future beyond the next herd, the next town. He smelled my mother's coffee and his whole life changed. He had the courage to act on what he felt and the wisdom to recognize something precious when he found it. Robert looked at his parents, sitting together at the head table with their hands clasped. They built more than just a successful business here. They built a family. They built a community. They built a legacy. And they did it together every single day, starting with coffee ground fresh every morning. There was applause and tears and laughter. One by one, family members stood to share their favorite memories. Stories about grandfather Thomas teaching them to count with coffee beans. Stories about Adelaide's kindness to customers down on their luck, quietly forgiving debts or sending food home with people who could not pay. Stories about Ryder's business acumen and fair dealing, his reputation for honesty that made the Ashford name mean something throughout the region. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Ryder and Adelaide found themselves alone in the cafe for a few minutes. William was in the kitchen cleaning up, and a few grandchildren were playing quietly in the corner, but for the moment they had relative peace. 40 years, Adelaide said wonderingly. How did we get here so fast? One day at a time, Ryder replied. One morning at a time. One cup of coffee at a time. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Adelaide asked. Your exact words. I asked if you would wake up beside me every morning, Ryder said. And you did. You have. And I will, Adelaide promised, for as long as we both shall live. They were in their 60s now, slowing down but still vibrant, still engaged with life. The cafe continued to thrive under William's management, and the boarding house was now run by Robert's wife, keeping the business in the family. Ryder and Adelaide spent their days helping where they were needed, spoiling their grandchildren and enjoying the life they had built. Each morning, without fail, they still ground coffee together. It took longer now, their hands not as strong or steady as they once were, but they persevered. It was their time, their ritual, the foundation of their marriage. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans still made Ryder's heart swell with gratitude, still reminded him of that first morning when he had been reckless enough to speak his heart to a stranger. More grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren. The world changed around them, new technologies and ways of life emerging, but the core of their existence remained constant. Love, family, community, and coffee ground fresh every morning. When they were both 71 years old, Adelaide fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, then progressed to weakness and fatigue. The doctor diagnosed her with pneumonia and prescribed bed rest, but Adelaide was a stubborn woman. She insisted on grinding the coffee every morning, even when she could barely stand. Finally, Ryder put his foot down. "I can grind the coffee," he said firmly. "You taught me 40 years ago, remember? Let me take care of you for once." "You take care of me every day," Adelaide protested weakly. "Then let me do more," Ryder insisted. "Please, Adelaide, you need to rest." She relented, and for the first time in their marriage, Ryder ground the coffee alone. It felt wrong, incomplete, but he did it anyway, making it exactly the way Adelaide had taught him. He brought her a cup in bed, and she smiled at the taste. "Perfect," she said softly. "You finally learned." "I had a good teacher," Ryder replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding her hand. Adelaide recovered slowly, her strength returning bit by bit. But she was changed by the illness, more fragile, more aware of her mortality. She and Ryder began to talk seriously about the future, about what would happen when one of them was gone. "I do not want to think about it," Ryder admitted one evening as they sat together on the porch of their home. They had moved out of the rooms above the cafe years ago into a small house nearby, but they still spent every day at the cafe. "We have to," Adelaide said gently. "We are not young anymore, Ryder. I need to know that you will be all right." "I will not be all right," Ryder said honestly. "How could I be?" "You are my heart, Adelaide. You have been my heart for over 40 years. And you will always have that," Adelaide said. "But life goes on. Our children and grandchildren need you. The business needs you. Promise me you will not just give up." "I promise," Ryder said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. He could not imagine a morning without Adelaide beside him, could not imagine grinding coffee alone day after day. But Adelaide did recover, fully this time. She returned to her usual activities, though at a slower pace. They celebrated their 45th anniversary quietly, just the two of them and their immediate family. They traveled to Austin to see Robert's family, then to Margaret's ranch. They spent time with William and his wife and children at the cafe, teaching the youngest generation how to grind coffee properly. The years were kinder after that. Both Ryder and Adelaide remained relatively healthy, slowing down but still active. They became beloved figures in Dalhart, the old couple who still held hands when they walked down the street, who still looked at each other with love after so many years. On their 50th anniversary, the whole town celebrated. The mayor declared it Ashford Day, and there was a parade and a party in the town square. Ryder and Adelaide sat in places of honor, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The current generation of Ashfords numbered in the dozens, a sprawling family tree that had grown from a single morning decision. 50 years, Adelaide marveled, looking at Ryder with eyes that still sparkled despite their age. Half a century of mornings together. 18,250 mornings, Ryder said. "Give or take a few, you are still counting." Adelaide laughed in delight. "I will always count," Ryder said seriously. "Every morning is still a gift." As they stood to cut the anniversary cake, surrounded by the family and community they had helped build, Ryder thought about that exhausted young cowboy riding into Dalhart so many years ago. That boy had no idea what awaited him, no concept of the richness that could come from taking a chance on love. He had been searching for nothing more than a hot meal and a cup of coffee, and he had found his whole world. The party went on around them, music and laughter filling the air. Children played tag around the tables while adults shared stories and memories. The cafe had been closed for the day, but someone had set up a coffee station, and the familiar rich aroma filled the square. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Ryder pulled Adelaide close for a dance. They moved slowly, carefully, their bodies remembering the steps even if they could no longer execute them with youthful grace. But it did not matter. They had each other and they had this moment, and they had 50 years of moments stretching behind them. "Thank you," Ryder whispered into Adelaide's silver hair. "Thank you for saying yes to a reckless cowboy. Thank you for 40,000 cups of coffee. Thank you for every morning." "Thank you for being brave enough to ask," Adelaide replied. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me through everything." They held each other as the music played and their family celebrated around them. The life they had built was not perfect, had never been perfect, but it was real and true and theirs. From coffee beans ground on a spring morning to this moment of golden light and love, they had walked every step together. The years after the 50th anniversary were peaceful. Ryder and Adelaide were content to let their children run the family businesses, stepping in only to offer advice or help when needed. They spent their days enjoying each other's company, taking slow walks around Dalhart, sitting on their porch watching the world go by. And every morning, without fail, they ground coffee together, their aged hands working in tandem, the ritual as comforting and necessary as breathing. When Ryder was 78 and Adelaide was 77, they both knew their time was growing short. Neither spoke of it directly, but there was a weight to their moments together, a consciousness that each day might be their last. They made sure to tell their children and grandchildren how much they loved them. They made sure their affairs were in order, their wishes known. One morning in late spring, Adelaide woke before dawn as usual. She reached for Ryder and found him already awake, watching her in the dim light. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," Ryder replied. Ready for coffee, they rose together, moving slowly through their morning routine. Down in the kitchen, Ryder got out the coffee beans while Adelaide prepared the grinder. Their movements were practiced, automatic, the result of over 56 years of repetition. As Adelaide began to turn the handle, Ryder put his hand over hers, stilling the motion. She looked at him questioningly. "I want to remember this," Ryder said. "This exact moment, you and me grinding coffee as the sun comes up. It is ordinary and it is everything." Adelaide smiled, her eyes misty. "I love you, Ryder Ashford. Every morning for 56 years I have loved you. And I will love you for whatever mornings we have left." "And I love you," Ryder said. "You gave me a life, Adelaide. A real life, not just existence. You gave me mornings worth waking up for." They finished grinding the coffee together, brewed it carefully, and sat at their kitchen table as the sun rose. The coffee was perfect, as it always was when Adelaide made it. They drank in comfortable silence, hands clasped across the table, grateful for another morning together. That is how their son William found them hours later, when he came by to check on them as he did every day. They had passed peacefully together, their hands still joined. The coffee cups sat empty on the table, and there was an expression of perfect peace on both their faces. The town of Dalhart mourned the loss of Ryder and Adelaide Ashford. They were laid to rest side by side in the town cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Together in life, together in eternity." They had 56 years of mornings. The cafe continued, run by William and then by his children. The tradition of grinding fresh coffee beans every morning was maintained, passed down through generations. Every Ashford child learned the proper technique, learned the importance of that morning ritual. It became more than just a way to make coffee. It became a tribute to love, to commitment, to the courage to take chances on the people and things that matter. Robert's children grew up to be lawyers and politicians, carrying on their father's legacy. Margaret's descendants continued to ranch, building an empire that stretched across the Panhandle. William's lineage stayed with the cafe and boarding house, maintaining the heart of the family business. But they all came together regularly, united by the story of how their family began, with a cowboy and a cup of coffee and the bravery to speak the heart. Years turned into decades. Dalhart grew and changed, evolving from a frontier town into a modern city. But the Ashford Cafe remained, a constant in a changing world. Tourists would come, drawn by the story of the place, of the romance that had started there. Local historians documented the tale of Ryder and Adelaide, and it became part of the town's identity, a symbol of hope and love. The coffee grinder that Adelaide had used that first morning was preserved, eventually finding its way into a small museum dedicated to Dalhart's history. The newer generations of Ashfords would bring their children to see it, to tell them the story of their ancestors. They would explain how a simple thing, the smell of coffee beans being ground, had changed the course of a life, had created a family, had built a legacy. In the end, it was a story about taking chances, about recognizing something precious when you find it and having the courage to reach for it, about building a life one day at a time, one morning at a time, with love as the foundation. It was a story about coffee and cowboys and the Wild West, but more than that, it was a story about two people who found each other against all odds and chose to wake up beside each other every morning for the rest of their lives. And every morning in the Ashford Cafe in Dalhart, Texas, someone ground fresh coffee beans, and the rich aroma filled the air, and people smiled, remembering. The legacy lived on, not just in business success or family size, but in the daily act of choosing love, of honoring commitment, of finding joy in simple rituals shared with the people who matter most. The story of Ryder and Adelaide became legend, passed down through generations, embellished and romanticized but always true at its core. A cowboy had walked into a cafe, smelled coffee being ground, and had the courage to ask for what he wanted. A woman had looked past convention and circumstance to see the heart of the man before her. Together they had built something lasting, something beautiful, something that endured long after they were gone. Their great-great-grandchildren still gathered at the cafe on special occasions, still told the story to anyone who would listen. The ritual of grinding coffee every morning remained sacred, a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And sometimes, on quiet spring mornings when the light slanted through the windows just right, people swore they could feel the presence of Ryder and Adelaide, standing together at the counter, grinding coffee and grateful for another morning together.